Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sanjay Ramabhadran. Welcome to the Texas Lyceum Forum on the role of allies. Um, this is the second in a series, which we had a really powerful conversation with our fellow directors, Bruce Rito, Terry Bruner, Glenwood Hill, and Michael Grace last week. Uh, Laura, our president, could not join us today with a family emergency, and we wish her and her family the best. And kudos to her and her leadership team for adapting really quickly to multiple situations and curveballs that keep getting thrown at them this year. And after the COVID series, we started off last week, and today we've got another lineup on the role of allies as we all look to how we can make a difference moving forward. Stephen Kleinberg, for those Houstonians on the call, just released a book on the city of Houston, the most diverse city in the country, as being a prophetic city. And in that, he quotes one of our directors, Mustafa Tami, saying that Houston is now a city of conveners and not kingmakers. The Lyceum has had a 40-year history of convening diverse opinions to make sure we all learn from each other and see how we can best move forward to position ourselves and our state in the 21st century. I think, if I may say this, very often most folks listen to reply, to respond quickly, to contradict, to probably give a counterpoint. I think some things have changed in just the last 2 to 3 weeks. I think all of us are keen and intend to listen to understand so that we may understand better and then respond in a meaningful way to move things forward. So that's what we intend to do this afternoon as well. And helping us do that are our three panelists: Katie Jones from the class of 2020, Kevin Robnett from the class of 2018, Joseph Kopser from the class of 2017, and to moderate 17, that's right. Margot McClendon, it's all yours. Again, just a reminder, this session is open only to active directors of the Texas Lyceum. With that, Margot, it's all yours. To our panelists, thank you all for joining us, and to our audience, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Sanjay. We really appreciate you. Hello, Lyceum directors. Thank you for taking the time to listen in. I hope you all are doing well this afternoon, and a big thank you goes to Laura Dixon and the Lyceum leadership for hosting these Zoom discussions. Again, my name is Dr. Margot McClinton Stoglin, founder and CEO of CRM & Associates, a minority certified management consulting firm established in 2011, and I'm a proud member of the class of 2018. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the current Lyceum directors, Bruce, Terry, Mike, and Glenn, for sharing your stories and experiences last week. We heard you and appreciate you. I must admit, friends, as a mother, daughter, and wife of Black males, the recent racial incidents in our country have been devastating. You see, my mother grew up in segregation. She shared stories about how life was separate but not equal. And I remember at the age of 8 being called the N-word when a classmate's mother did not want me at her daughter's birthday party. We all can do something. We can all do something to improve the current state of affairs. Therefore, we must ask each other how we can work together. That's how we get to this title today of our program, The Role of Allies. Again, with that in mind, I'm excited about our esteemed panelists. We have Joseph Kasper from class of 2017, Kevin, 2018, and Katie, 2020. I would like the panelists to go around and share a little bit about yourself and how do you define being an ally?
Who do you want to go first?
Let's have Joseph. You go ahead.
Okay. So my name is Joseph Kopser. If I hadn't had a chance to meet you yet, I look forward to meeting you. My quick backstory was growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, going off to West Point, 20 years in the United States Army, a lot of different assignments from the tactical to the strategic. After that, got up into the startup world, the high-tech side of Austin and the entrepreneurial scene. Had a lot of success there. We sold our company to Mercedes And then I had another career pivot, my third or fourth one, depending on how you're counting, and then ran for Congress here in Central Texas for 2 years. So in all four of the different sectors, because I count my 5 years teaching in academia, saw a lot of different kinds of organizations, types of people at all levels. And before we get into my connection as an ally or an aspiring ally, to quote Katie from yesterday, I would define an ally as anyone who is attempting to push back. And what I mean by that is in the world of physics, we know that a body at rest stays at rest till something acts on it. So in the context of racism or sexism or classism, an anti-racist, or in this case, an ally, is someone who sees something that's going on that though they themselves may not be the victim or the target themselves, but they step in a way as to be able to push back. So that's how I would define an ally. But I really appreciate being a part of this discussion to add my experience to it.
Thank you, Joseph. Katie, you want to share?
Sure, great. Thanks, Margot. I'm Katie Ray Jones. I'm the CEO of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and I have been doing domestic violence work for over 25 years. I certainly, from my experience working in social services, have seen acts of racism throughout my career, and I think that's really brought me on my journey to be an aspiring ally, was really having those moments of time where I would begin to get curious as to why a woman of color had difficulty getting into a shelter, or having trouble accessing medical services versus a white woman. And then just really digging in and being really curious about how I, as a white person, could show up to be an ally to people of color, to make sure that I know when to stop and listen, when to step aside, when I can hold someone else accountable to racist behaviors or racist acts.
Thank you. Kevin?
Hey guys, real treat for me to be here. Appreciate Margot, Laura, everybody for inviting me to the conversation. Kevin, 10th generation Texan. My family is east of Beaumont, which a lot of Texans don't know there is about 30 miles of the state over there. And in the deep piney woods behind the curtain. Grew up with a Spanish grandmother, didn't learn to speak English till she was about 15, but I look very white. And I have some classism comments I'll share with you later about that. But UT undergrad, UT law, intelligence community for about 11 and a half years, 10 of which were in the Navy. Private equity guy, so I've been in that world, oil and gas more specifically. So I have some comments I think that are somewhat useful in my experiences there about not only the classism, but also sexism and racism in that field that I'm in. But yeah, to define ally, I actually was thinking about this a lot, and I think I'm going to go more broadly. I agree with Joseph and Katie too. I mean, I think we're not going to find a lot of disagreements on what an ally is, but I was struck when I just happened to think about, let me go look this up, and two verbs or two definitions of the singular of the word ally, and one is ally. And as I was thinking about my own definition, what I kept coming to was, well, it's friendship. It's about understanding that we should be judged by the content of our character and not by really a whole lot else, not your money, not your gender, not your race, or any of those issues that we can get to, but that's what an ally is to me. And so the definition of ally is to combine or unite a resource or commodity with another for a common benefit. And I thought, that's it. That's what I think of being an ally, is to ally. So you switch it to the verb, and it's a little bit of an action. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I do that in my life when we get to it. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for each of you sharing that. We just heard from our panelists, and they shared what does it mean to be an ally to them. But let's ask ourselves quickly, what's the formal definition? According to the dictionary, to be an ally means that a person who uses their privilege to advocate on behalf of someone else who doesn't hold that same privilege. But really, like Kevin hinted at, we want to take it a step further. We want to talk about allyship, which is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. You see, it's not self-defined. The work and the efforts must be recognized by those you are seeking to ally with. Lyceum already values allyship in so many ways. We all come together from different parts of the state to build relationships and alliances with others at our meetings. We are diverse in our race, sexuality, religion, gender, and politics. With our housing and race meetings, we also engage with others that are marginalized. I'm proud to be a part of this organization, the Lyceum, because it does value others. So let's talk a little bit about how allies impact social justice. I'm defining social justice as the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. But this is a formal definition. What we really want to say is, how do we dismantle racism, sexism, and classism? So Joseph, let's begin with you. In the world you live in and the world that you work in, how have you seen allies and make an impact on social justice issues for you, your family, and your community?
Well, thanks, Margot. So for me, that it's more about how it came to now. So we have to go all the way back to my childhood and how this is a part of it. So I had the experience as a kid living in a neighborhood that was right between two different parts of town. One was more inner city, where I went to a Title I elementary school. And then on the other side of my neighborhood was a very affluent part of town. And so we were kind of the buffer in the middle. So consequently, the school I went to, Maxwell Elementary School, I had a lot of friends who were, for the most part, I mean, Title I, they were living, a lot of them on food stamps. And I took that to be the norm of how everyone lived. And because of my youth, and I had great parents, I was able to see color, but not distinguish between colors, so much so that Derwin and Darwin Cloyd and Terrence Pope and Dale Smith were all my best friends on the kickball team. But most importantly, like I love to point out, and it just doesn't come up in normal conversation, but Lene Wilson, who was Black herself, like many of our friends, was my first real girlfriend. So my first girlfriend, in fact, on the way to Kings Island in the back of the bus, was my first real kiss with Lene Wilson. And so that was my experience. But when I went to junior high and high school, that's where, instead of going into the same track they were in terms of schools, I went to that more affluent high school. So I went from being in a mixed community to being in a rather white community. And then, to be honest, I was shocked. I was shocked at what I was seeing and hearing. But luckily for me, in sixth grade at that same time, I had a teacher who, Mrs. Audrey Grievous, a civil rights icon of the 1960s. I mean, she stood at the lunch counter demanding service despite the color of her skin. She was imprinting on me and all of our classmates this idea: if you see a problem, go and fix it. So that was the starting point. So as I went later, it was much easier for me to hear racism and bias among my friends, especially if it was a circle of white guys or whatever the context might have been. But luckily for me, let me just back up. Unfortunately, I was not the best ally I could have been back then. I was the silent participant. I may have said, hey, that's not right, or I might have kept quiet, but I didn't have the personal confidence to push back as an ally and say, that's a load of horseshit. You know, you're just quoting this or that or whatever racist or frankly ignorant common theme of what was being taught to so many other families. So fast forward to West Point. West Point, part of the United States Army, part of the, the extension of Truman, President Truman's work in the 1950s to integrate our military, so much so that as a cadet in leadership, I had once again returned to a community where my friends were from all over the place. And in the process, let me see, unplug this. Can you all still hear me? Okay, good. In the process of doing all of that, what I realized was, everything I learned in high school from my friends, who were many of them, quite frankly, idiots, that I had to speak out. But it was even easier to do in the Army when I got into the United States Army, because so much of what the Army had done since Truman integrated the force allowed me to be once again surrounded by people of all backgrounds and colors to once again feel comfortable speaking out. I had the confidence. I mean, my first sergeant, and if you don't know the context of the military, but he's a senior enlisted soldier in your unit. He, as a Black man, was an amazing force for good. They gave all of us the confidence to be able to speak out and push back, to be the ally on some of our peers in the military that maybe didn't have those experiences. He later went on to be Sergeant Major Academy superintendent. So I was fortunate to have always been surrounded by people who were role models, but most importantly, because of my parents and Mrs. Grievous and my friends, realized that it's not enough to just be quiet in situations of racism, but it's really an opportunity for us to push back and call bullshit, and hopefully speak up and not be silent. So
Very
that's
good.
my story and experience with all of it.
Thank you, Joseph. I think you raised our conversation to PG-13, but that's okay. You know, when we heard you talk about this a little bit yesterday, I shared with you that the takeaway from what you're saying is that you can't always judge a book by its cover, right? And
That's right.
your experiences may not be the stereotypical white man experience. And so thank you for sharing that. I'm going to now give Kevin one of the tougher questions. But again, Joseph, thanks for sharing your experience. Kevin, where have you personally struggled with being an ally? What should allies do when others make racist or generally inappropriate comments?
Can y'all hear me?
Mhm.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate getting that tough question. You know what? I think it's an interesting question because it, to me, is not so tough other than what I'm about to say. I think that happens. I think the tough thing is not what to say, but to say something. The hardest part, I think, for us to do is have this conversation. Meaning, when you, as an ally or as a friend, and on the race issue, it's entirely different than the sexism and the classism, which I think we need to get to too. We all want to talk about race so much because it's so prescient and in our face, and I think that's important. But it's real tough. I think that I keep thinking about it's sort of like the old Saint Francis of Assisi quote, you know, speak the gospel always, and when you need to, use words. And I think there's an important message there that goes to this about being an ally and about being a friend of, in racial context or sexism context. It is about doing things that literally shun that type of behavior. And what I mean by that, and Joseph and I share military background in that way, the one thing that I would do to be a good leader is you don't laugh at the joke. You don't accept it. You don't be an ass, but you don't accept it. You just don't go along with it. You don't have to ostracize yourself from the crowd, because that's not leading either. To be the other in a group that you're trying to influence doesn't help anybody. And so what I think is, to be a good ally, to be a good friend, doesn't mean that you are different. It doesn't mean that you don't want to have the finger out and point to people and say that's wrong and I'm right, because there's that self-righteousness and all that goes into it. So I think with that, it is to be addressed. I think it is to not be ignored. The comments should not be accepted. It should be a known thing that around you as an ally, that's just not something that I tolerate. It's not something I laugh at. It's not something that I even want to entertain. It'd be like, it's the word choices that people use in your presence. Say, hey man, pump the brakes on the language. I don't use that word, or whatever it may be. And I think that's literally a powerful testament, and that's all you need to say. You don't need to preach. You don't need to do much. It's the St. Francis. You be. And then by influencing and by being a leader in that way, I think people kind of follow and they understand who you are as a person. That's what I got.
Yeah, to Kevin's point, it's powerful, I believe, in a group, especially if it's all a bunch of white dudes standing around. If one of them makes a racist or inappropriate joke or comment, it just takes one person to be like Kevin said, dude, not cool.
That's not cool.
Woo, that has a chilling effect for good.
Oh, you got to say, this is not cool. Yeah.
So lead by example, ultimately. Yeah, thank you so much. And we are hearing those kind of conversations happen quite a bit, and we even hear them in the media. Katie, we're both moms. My daughter just recently shared with me that a teacher in her district was fired for saying that the police should shoot all those people down, and then they can go back to Africa. As you know, this is a terrible thing for her to hear, and it's infuriating to put a parent in this position. What can we do to teach our children to be allies?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Margot. I think, the mistake I think a lot of people, especially white people, make is the first thing that we say is we don't see color, and we teach our kids that, where really we want to talk about differences and how to accept differences. I think as us as adults, we recognize difference is in everything that we do, not just race, but sex, class, age. And we have lots of isms that are really rooted in difference that people use power over when they feel like their difference is better than someone else's. So I think it's really about really teaching our kids about how to recognize difference, how to do some of the things Kevin just said, how to be able to speak up and show courage, while also teaching vulnerability, right? I think especially when we think about the gender roles associated with being a young boy. And, when I grew up, I remember people saying like, boys don't cry. And then really setting up really rigid male stereotypes that, play out in my work today as a domestic violence advocate. But really being able to be thoughtful about how do we teach our children how to resolve conflict. I was a preschool teacher for many years, and we used to say, use your words, hands are not for hitting. And then we leave preschool and we don't hear those words the same way anymore, about how to really be kind to one another. I think in my journey and trying to be an aspiring ally, I also really had to learn to be vulnerable, that I was going to make mistakes. And that's about teaching our kids, you will make mistakes. And that's okay too. And then how do you learn from them? And then really, I think, I'm a mother of 3 boys, 3 Black boys who have had racism happen to them. And so as a mother and as a white mother, I've really had to think about my whiteness and my privilege that shows up, and how I teach them how to react to racism. So when my 13-year-old son was called the N-word last year, he really kind of brushed it off. And my husband and I had to have this conversation. He had every right to be hurt, enraged, and that there was action that we could take. Now, we know the full story, that another kid actually jumped in and stood in front of my son when another child was going to hit him for challenging him for saying the N-word. And I think that's what being an ally is, right? Being really encouraging our kids to be courageous, to challenge things that don't feel right, sound right, to challenge when things are hurtful and painful, and to be able to really recognize that, yes, there is difference. And then how do you manage, and how do you support and lift up and make sure that we're striving towards an equitable society? I think that's a lot to unpack, as we talked yesterday, even around power and hierarchy and class, race. There's so many things to unpack, specifically even around sexism in our country, that it's really right now in our country, centering conversations around race is incredibly important for us to be talking to our kids about what is happening. What are they seeing on the news? What is happening to Black people in our country? And how can we as white people show up differently to create a better future?
Thank you. Wow, powerful. And thanks for sharing that you do have Black boys, and that you have that biracial dynamic in your family. And that is always a challenge, because we are a nation divided in many ways. And so when we see it in our homes, we have to be even more careful to really teach our youth about the differences, but yet ensure that they're empowered. So thank you for sharing that. We only have a couple more questions, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So if you have questions, get them ready, write them in the question box and the chat box. And then I know Sanjay has some things he wants to share at the end. So as we begin to wrap up, I would like everyone to kind of think about, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you? And I'm going to turn to the panelists to ask them just generically, this has been a very controversial statement in our country, but what does it mean to you when you hear Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I'll go first again. So for me, what I think it is, and I want to reflect on this, not just how I hear it, but I want to reflect on more what I hear from so many of my peers, being friends or family. And let me be very clear, I'm talking about those who don't get it, the ones that don't understand. That's separate from my opinion. My opinion, of course, I think I laid out pretty well that, of course, Black Lives Matter, as they did at any point in my career or even as a child. But what they are hearing and where they're struggling, so many of them are struggling, is they are saying very straightforward. And I'm not talking about the fanatics or the extremes, but what they are saying is they're saying, look, and you probably have seen this on Facebook many times. Look, my parents came over from Italy or Germany in the early 1920s. My parents had to learn to speak English with this. My parents did this, and you know, my parents were the first ones to go to college. So what they're trying to do, they are really struggling with this phrase, because what they think is that for some reason, if we say that Black Lives Matter, that their struggles don't count. And I think the thing that I can do as an ally in pushing back on those views and that attitude is simply to say that while no one's discounting their struggle, while no one's discounting their sacrifice, that it's not even close, it's not even in the ballpark in terms of the systemic racism that occurred, not just by the framers of the Constitution, but we got to go all the way back to 1619 if we were going to have an honest conversation, and how that has permeated society, and it's found itself bubbled up in every part of the community. And so for me, of course, Black Lives Matter, but if this conversation is to be frank about those whites who we are trying to be allies to push against, to help them see, they're really struggling with this. And again, it is so influenced by social media, it is so influenced by cable news, that it is really hard to try to punch through and get to the real meaning of what's going on.
Thank you, Joseph. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think for me, Black Lives Matter is really centering and being focused on the injustices done to the Black community for centuries, and that it's recognizing that and trying to strategize collectively how to make sure we don't have any more George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, Mike Brown's. I mean, how are we going to ensure that beyond police brutality that we're seeing, that there's also the systemic racism that happens, access to services, medical care. I mean, the research is endless to show that it's not equitable in our country, even getting a job to this day. And that's recent research, and that we're going to really center the Black community in this space and create space for Black voices. I think this is really about challenging a lot of passive statements that are made around, identifying Black people as being angry. My husband gets that all the time. And there was an amazing Facebook post in our, not amazing, hurtful, amazing response, but of a group of men standing, and they're all staring into the sun, being blinded. They all have exactly the same facial expression when you're staring into sun. And someone says, "What's up with that Black guy though? He looks really angry." And that was an opportunity for white people to show up in a way to say, like, well, take a second look at that picture. Everybody actually has the same expression on their face. But he was immediately labeled angry. So I think this is really a space when we think about Black Lives Matter and how even people continue to make passive comments, an opportunity to challenge and increase our own awareness and educate ourselves on the experiences of Black people so that we can best show up.
Mm-hmm. There's a double standard. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think for me in my sort of limited worldview here, what Black Lives Matter means to me is probably a little different. I think it is a symbol of a conversation, one which I think we've needed to have for a long time, one that I kind of believe has been happening just slowly. So for me, when I think about what's happening with I also don't think BLM or whatever we're saying actually encompasses what's actually happening. I think it's sort of being kidnapped, and I think it's being exploited, and I think it's being taken advantage of is what I think too. So I think we'll talk about that in a second, but for me, what Black Lives Matter really represents right now is an acceleration of a conversation, both good and bad. So I'm not all, I don't look at this as a net positive. I think it can be, and I hope that the results will go that way. But some of the secondary and tertiary effects of what is being done to have this conversation are troubling. And I think that there are, because of that accelerant, because it is accelerated due to, we have confluence of events, we're all at home,
Right.
we're hyper focused on this, which I think is a blessing. That's a good thing. The bad things are the demands being made, the efforts being done, the tactics being pursued are not all good. And I don't necessarily think good for either side. If there is a side, it's not a binary, it's a conversation. So for me, Black Lives Matter right now is this question mark. It is not, this is not MLK versus Malcolm X versus, Forwell and Strom Thurmond over here. This is a much more dynamic conversation. And for me, frankly, emblematic of a millennial conversation. It seems that we want instant results and we want a postable result. Both sides. I want to show you my black friend as a white guy. And as a black person, I want to show you my anger and my 10 demands. And I'm wondering, well, what in the hell do we actually want out of this? So for me, that's what it is. It's a question mark.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Analogy that I heard is if you call the fire department because your house is on fire and the fire department comes to your neighborhood and says, you know what, I need to extinguish all the houses in your neighborhood, you're saying, but wait a minute, my house is on fire. Can you please give me some water first and then we can get the rest of the houses? I think that's kind of the quickest and easiest way to make the analogy. And I just saw Owen pop up that just because we say Black Lives Matter does not exclude all lives. It's an and, not an or. And Joseph, yesterday when we were chatting, you went there and brought up, why would people take to the streets in anger and burn down a Wendy's in Atlanta? You want to talk a little bit about that? You had some.
Yeah, I had a lot of friends that were struggling with this, and they were asking me, and they're like, well, why do they resort to that? Why do they resort to violence and they just burn it down? And my point to them was, just as any person goes through the 5 or 7 stages of grief, besides denial, and before you get to acceptance, in the middle there, you have anger. And while I'm not excusing burning it down, I'm trying to help them understand what a people or what a group or what an organization would do when they feel like they have no last resort.
Right.
And then as someone who used to teach at West Point, teach American politics and history and government, I used to love taking my students who, again, came from all backgrounds, but they're all very patriotic Americans wanting to serve the public. And then I asked them, I said, okay, can you, and this is in the context of the backdrop of the war in Iraq, and I said, can you tell me the name of the insurgency where the people felt so oppressed by those that were in their land, they viewed as, foreign occupiers who were not listening to them, who were treating them improperly, who were treating them with violence, and who were not bringing equal justice? What would you call them? And every student in the class raised their hand, oh, that's easy, that's Al-Qaeda, that's Al-Qaeda. And I said, no, you knuckleheads. If it was the 1770s, we would have called them patriots. We would have called them the Minutemen, practicing non-traditional guerrilla war style tactics, burning everything down. So all I'm trying to say is to my friends that can't understand what's going on, while you don't have to excuse it, you have to try to understand the level of frustration it would take to bring a person to that point in their life. And if they have no other alternatives and they think that is the only way to go, then we have real problems we have to sit and talk about. So Margot, thanks for letting me tell that story again.
Yeah. We all have to listen and we all have to let our voices be heard. Let's shift really quickly. Last piece, and then we'll go to Q&A, is that in your opinion, what can we do as individuals to be allies? And there's so many different, strategies that we've heard. Katie, what have you heard that really can be helpful?
Sorry, I muted so you wouldn't hear my dogs barking. I think first educating yourself. I think, there's not an excuse that you can't educate yourself, whether that's through various resources, books, YouTube. I mean, there's so many great things. I know many folks are talking about the book White Fragility. Robin DiAngelo actually has YouTube videos you can watch if you're not up for the read. Even on Netflix right now, there's a whole Black Lives Matter series. 13 is really powerful around systemic racism and what's happening through the criminal justice system. Just Mercy is also good to watch. There's a lot of really powerful moments. And I think when you're reading and just getting curious about yourself and how you're showing up, if you're a white person or even a non-Black person of color at this point in time, given conversations in our country about how you can best show up and really center around Black experiences right now in our country. I think it's also about being vulnerable, and there's a lot of great material about vulnerability right now. Brene Brown also does a lot of work around the intersectionality of vulnerability and race. And so I think there's really a good space to realize that if you're going to move in this space, you are absolutely going to make a mistake. I shared this yesterday. I do it all the time. I've probably already done it in this 1 hour we've been together, where you will absolutely put your foot in it. It doesn't mean to stop what you're doing, go learn where you messed up and then change the behavior. And I'm always reminded that it's when I do mess up, it's not about who I am as a person. It's about my behavior that I need to change and focus on. So I think it's really about getting curious about how you're showing up, read, watch, listen. And when you're not sure and you hear something, go look it up. Don't rely on people of color, if you're white, to teach you the right way to move forward or to best show up.
Very good. Thank you, Katie. I know as an African-American woman, it's very frustrating sometimes when people come to me and I don't feel like they've done their homework and they may ask questions that are not well informed. And then there's these micro and macro aggressions that may occur, like grabbing my hair and like, ooh, how often do you wash your hair? And how, just questions that I could honestly say could be disrespectful. Joseph, do you have any thoughts on asking well-informed questions?
Yeah, I'll use it in the context of analogy. So another area so I am white, not black. I am also a male, not female. But I had the honor and privilege, and still do, of being a dad to 3 daughters who are now in their 20s. And one of the hardest things I had to learn how to do, and whether it was because of a place of privilege or whatever description you want to use, the hardest thing that I had when they would come home from school, whether it be a fight with a friend or troubles with a boyfriend or a teacher that they felt was picking on them or whatever the context, I always had to use their parlance, I always had to check myself to make sure that I wasn't rushing too quickly in to either try to solve their problem, give them advice, tell them how to do it. And what they, specifically my daughters, and every context is different, what they wanted more was someone to just listen to them vent, get it off their chest. And then when that period of time was over, then perhaps they were ready to then ask me to participate as an ally or to get involved or to give me their perspective. Every person is different. Every context is different. But I've learned to just recognize, especially as a straight white male growing up in middle-class America, that was kind of what the framers were, trying to organize this to benefit. I recognize that when I step into situations as Katie described, I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth. Of course, there are going to be times I make mistakes, but hopefully they recognize, whoever I've offended, that it's not coming from a place of ignorance, or it is, I guess, more ignorance, but it's certainly not that I'm not sincerely trying to help.
All right. And Kevin, how do you think people can work on reflecting on their own bias?
Yeah, I think it's great. And, not to move the ism, but I think it goes across the isms. I think we work on our biases, and I think kind of going to what Joseph said, I really do think it's about pausing and reflecting about what we're doing. I remember there's a couple little anecdotes I'll share. One was I was selected to be on the presidential search committee. I was the student on the search committee when we picked the new president for UT Austin when Larry Faulkner retired. And I remember it was a fabulous experience. Got a lot of info. Got to put my suit on and go be with all these academic search firm. And one of the things that I remember was we had interviewed all these people, provosts, presidents of other schools that were trying to get this post. And I happened to make a comment that has stuck with me. I said that we were giving our feedback on the top 5. And I remember saying this phrase. It said, that individual doesn't look like a president, okay? And what I meant was, not interpreted this way, but what I meant was this guy was the kind of professor that had chalk on the back of his suit. It was kind of a half tucked in shirt. It was not about race, gender, whatever. But one of the professors on this selection committee, nameless, she runs a center at UT now, so I won't mention her, but she kind of gave me a schooling about, don't say that. Don't say look like a president, because what does that mean? Does it mean, white guy with a, whatever. So it was a good education. So I remember that. I'll tell you another though. So the second one that I have that I think is interesting and how we deal with this in real life has to do with classism. So I was mentioning, I'm this old East Texas guy, not rich, parents, first generation college, I'm second. Like I had a lawn mowing company to get me through UT. So like, I'm not the norm, but I'll tell you what, I worked for a guy named Joe Strauss, very good looking, extraordinarily affluent family. And Joe and I are great friends, would go with Joe to events. And I had on multiple occasions, people tell me, oh, well, you must be from Alamo Heights. You must know Joe Strauss because you're that. And I would say, no, I'm from Little Cypress. Do you know where that is? And they'd say, well, no. And I would say, well, why did you think I was from there? Right. And they'd say, well, you look like you're from there. And I've had that happen to me forever. And it's like, man, you don't know, man. I'm a trailer park guy. I didn't grow in a trailer. My cousins did. And, it's where we are. We're Spanish farmers from East Texas. And my point is, there's isms around us all the time. There's biases that we bring in we don't even mean to. You look like a military guy. You look like an executive. You look like a liberal. All those things are false. Doesn't mean anything. And so my point is to Joseph's, I agree with you. It's pausing and making sure, just giving that 2-3 seconds of delay before you
Right.
say it in your mind. That's what I would say about that.
Right. Well, we could share so much. Kevin, that was excellent. Just great examples about not judging, again, the book by its cover. Another way we can definitely be better allies is getting involved in the community and giving back in a genuine and consistent way. Share your time, resources, talents within the community. But let's realize also how racial inequities impact education, the digital divide, finance, access to capital, healthcare, access to COVID testing and insurance. We see it in nonprofits, business, law, the hiring, training, and retention policies and practices, housing, affordable, redlining, criminal justice system, police brutality. If you work in any of these areas, you can help move the needle. And being part of the Lyceum, we are a part of all these areas and we can make a difference. So let's go to Q&A real quick. I have 4 questions in the queue. Can you talk about how to handle that not so overtly racist moments, the times when colleagues say, there is just something about Glenn. I just don't see him as a team player. Or Tam, you're getting really angry. Those are microaggressions. Those are judging people by their skin color, and many times are using a double standard. We got a lawyer among the group. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that one?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to disagree with on the premise that, that you kind of hit it. There is and I think I would probably challenge the systemic racism claims that I've heard, but in those arenas, I don't think it's very difficult to deny. It's a problem, it comes from, again, going back to that bias that we all, have to struggle with across these isms that we have. But in the racial arena, I think it is, you're worried about, and I think we got a great little chat going with Tam, and she mentioned something about, where you have people say, well, look how angry they're getting. Or, I think people are fearful of the race card. And so we know we need diversity, but yet we're fearful that diversity is going to be used against, the objective we're trying to get. So I think, in my little limited part of the world with oil and gas and finance, which we talked about yesterday, I'll tell you, it is so rare to see diversity in that part of the economy that it's astounding. The people that I know that are, African American, Asian American, so forth, they're badass. They're the best at what they do, period. But it is so rare that it's so homogenized, as a culture, especially oil and gas. And I really don't have a great answer for that, other than it's just one of those industries too that I don't necessarily know that I would say that it's racism that's caused it so much as it is geography. I think that plays a huge role in some of these things. You think about.
You mean culture? Is that what you're trying to, you mean a cultural difference?
Well, maybe.
Well, no, I mean, physically, literally geography. I mean, I think like oil and gas generally,
Oh, okay.
I think it's just not in areas that have historically had diverse populations.
Yeah, Margo,
Okay.
can I jump in on Tam's point?
Sure.
So maybe, and Tam, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm interpreting this correctly, but I think what you're implying is in a setting, let's just say it's a group setting, majority white group, and then a woman there, in this case, Tam happens to be a black woman who is, for whatever reason, pushing back or disagreeing, and then a white guy on the end is like, there's Tam getting angry again. A microaggression, as if
Yes.
doesn't realize the implicit bias of to assume either because she is a woman or a black woman that their response is to become the angry black woman. The way I would handle that, and this did happen quite a bit either in the context of the classroom in 5 years or 20 years in the military, when people are exposing their implicit bias and they don't even realize it, the way I have chose to handle it is not necessarily to push back directly to them to call out a microaggression or implicit bias or call it their privilege. What I love to do is to draw the analogy of someone else similar in whatever the comment was, who I know because I can hear it and be like, oh yeah, Tam is exactly angry just like George was 5 minutes before in the same context, and they're both right. And then George, in this context of this hypothetical, is a white guy. That person with the implicit bias, hopefully, even if they don't recognize what's happening, but in their brain, hopefully is a small connection between two neurons that says, you know what, you can actually be mad and push back, and your response should be the same whether it is a white man or a black woman. So that's what I've tried to do over the years in leadership positions, maybe not always successful, but it's one by one trying to reconnect those neurons in a different way.
That's a quintessential example of addressing it, but not being too assertive. And that's a great way to be an ally. Thanks for sharing that. Katie, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also time that, we set a level playing field in our organizations about talking about race. I think, we talk about not wanting to talk about the isms necessarily. But I think in our own organization, we started doing racial equity work about 8 years ago, and trained our whole entire team, board of directors, about racial equity and what that meant in the organization and what courageous conversations needed to take place for us to truly be an anti-racist organization. As part of that, now, if that happens, I will point out this feels racialized, specifically if it is a white staff person who's saying it. I mean, to Joseph's example, like if I'm in a room and I'm watching that dynamic play out and that's not being said about George, I'm going to call it out. This feels very racialized to me. Let's break this down and talk about it. And I'm going to do that white person to white person, certainly. So I think there's a space where, as you're beginning to do the work and doing that education, I'm sorry?
In the room or afterwards?
Afterwards. Yeah, I would do that afterwards. Yeah, I would definitely do that afterwards and have that conversation. We have those conversations now on a regular basis, and internally, externally. I think that especially if you're having a certain member of the team who's constantly making those comments and it's constantly pointing out that, the people that they're providing feedback on are people of color, that is a very different conversation that I'm going to have. This is the time to call out the microaggressions and label it what it is, so that people can then begin to learn. I think there's also those shared commitments in the workplace that need to happen where we can certainly say that this is the culture we're trying to create, where everybody feels safe, where everybody feels welcome and included. It's not easy. And I think it's specifically in our own organization, when we first started it, folks tried to shut it down. They were like, we don't want to talk about race. And then it was like, this is why we need to. And now it's a place where certainly we have a lot more work to do, but we're seeing more and more people of color talk about even how white culture permeates organizations, businesses, companies, communication styles in the workplace. And if we really want to dismantle racism, we have to be okay with dismantling the white culture that permeates many of our organizations.
Well said, Katie. And many times we also have seen where someone will say something and then the majority will say it and then they get credit and attention for it. We see that play out as well. We have another question. How much more positive or negative has social media culture had on race relationships? Or relations. So we have seen social media just change the whole landscape. Thank God I didn't grow up with social media. and how it works today. These kids really have to balance all that. But any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Joseph.
So I'd like to go back in history. So was Sojourner Truth, if I think I have the name right, was the photographer that took pictures of actual slave families in the 1800s in the South that were so shocking, because it's one thing to have it drawn in a book, but it was another to see the stark reality that led to finally pushing back in a way that set the conditions later on that ended up in first Civil War and then emancipation and then the Civil Rights Amendment. So there is value in exposing it. So just as those photographs of the 1910s exposed the tremendous slum and poverty inside of immigrant districts inside of New York City, and they tried to fix that. And then again, the 50s and the 60s with the stark contrast of the images of the Deep South. Today, social media is helping show those images. So that is good. But I think it's almost a net zero or a net gain of nothing, in the sense that it also now expands completely ridiculous conspiracy theories. It more quickly spreads disinformation. And so I think it becomes all the more important that we return back to conversations like this one. So I would say it's almost a net even. One hand, it's great to expose the injustice. The other hand is it just spreads craziness that much faster.
I wanted to comment to that too. And Tomas, thank you for the question. I thought it was great. And it's something that I thought would come up a little earlier, just about the influence that we're all feeling as we look at our Insta and Facebooks and whatever we're doing. I was thinking about this, and Joseph, kind of going back to yours on Sojourner's pictures were great. I was thinking about this. There's this first act of a series of about 6 or 7 that Congress passed in 1872. This is something that I'm a nerd and I knew about, but it has to do with social media today. Back then, the Postmaster General was given this ability to prevent the distribution of, quote, harmful material to postal facilities. And what that basically was designed to do, Congress was empowering, sort of giving the authority to somebody else to control what was then social media about the free slaves. And it was designed with racial intent the whole time. And it was literally a strangulation of information flow across the country. And that lasted literally until Teddy Roosevelt. So you think about a 40-year almost period of time when that was happening. And I think about kind of going forward, it's always been there. The social media, is it good? Is it bad? Is publication good? Are there racial intent behind it? And been thinking on this, talked to Admiral Inman, you guys, a lot of you know Bobby Ray Inman, old boss of mine, but also a mentor, longest serving chairman of director of National Security Agency, said that we're now tracking more activity from outside the country, influencing social media dialogue around Antifa, around messaging, these fake accounts, these images, these false conversations that are occurring are algorithm based, and they are not our friends. And so I think back to this election and the influence that it's sort of undeniably there. We're feeling it. And so I'm with Joseph. I think that it's been nice to, I guess, see some commentary from really good friends who I know really well, but the larger conversation being steered in one way or the other, I think is pretty deleterious to the conversation. So I'm with you, Joe. I think this is the kind of these and around dinner tables and around coffee and the beer summits that we're all having with our friends are where we're really going to communicate.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. And the reality is, we heard Will Smith talk about it, that a lot of the things that we're seeing right now are not new. They could even be worse, but now we're filming it and it can go viral in 30 seconds, right? And it was kind of the perfect storm because we were all, at our homes during COVID and we could pay attention. Anybody else have any other thoughts on social media? I'm going to turn to Sanjay, who wants to ask one final question and have an announcement. Anybody else on social media? We're good? Okay. Well, thank you so much to all our panelists. We just really, really appreciate you. You guys were brilliant and open and vulnerable and informative. Sanjay, do you have one last question for the panelists and announcement?
I think mine was more of an announcement, but thank you, Margot. Thank you, Katie, Joseph, and Kevin. If I could, I think everybody is wanting to make a difference and wants to be an ally. Inadvertently, would an ally be doing something that is not helpful? And could you speak to that? Not intentionally.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm certainly labeled an ally many times, which is why I use the word aspiring ally, because it's certainly not a phase where you reach allyship and then you've arrived. I think we're constantly trying to learn and grow, and recognizing that we will absolutely make mistakes in the process. Again, not who I am as a being, but it's my behavior. And I've been cultured in a way, in my whiteness and my privilege, that, you know, if I'm not constantly laser focused on it and how I'm showing up, the opportunity there, as Joseph said, to put your foot in your mouth, to cause, regardless of my intent, to have a negative impact on someone. So yeah, I think it's certainly there, and it doesn't mean I lose my aspiring ally, you know, title. It just means I got to continue to do work.
Right. And when people aren't open and honest, nor are they vulnerable, and they're patronizing, or they tokenize, oh, I think we need someone in that position of color, but they have no commitment to who they are and what they bring to the table, and they sit there and tell them that they're not a team player and they're always angry. That's not helpful. That's not going to move the needle. So we all have a voice. We all have to use our sphere of influence. We all have to use our time and talent in order to achieve racial justice.
Appreciate that. As with all of our Lyceum forums, we could go on for another 30 minutes or an hour, and that's the reason we have hospitality suite when we meet in person. So here's to continuing these conversations at the dinner tables, at the beer summits, and hopefully soon in person at a hospitality suite. In the meantime, want to again thank all the panelists, thank everybody for making the time. As Tim Russett would probably say, if it's Thursday 4 p.m., it must be Lyceum hour. It's not Meet the Press. With that note, next Thursday, we will have a conversation on equity and policy, so that we can look at influencing public policy that we can all be proud of and that works for all Texans in all geographic corners of the state as well. And also on July 2nd, you all should have received an email about the ANC process and the 4 candidates that we have that are vying to be the president-elect and will serve as president of the Texas Lyceum in 2022. In my 7 years of the Lyceum, this is probably the first time we've had 4 candidates, which is good, that you've got a larger group that's aspiring to serve in that position. And we will have a town hall on Zoom on Thursday at 4 p.m. on July 2nd. So please tune in for that as well. With that, thank you all for joining. You all continue to be well and be safe as we face this pandemic, and do everything we can to fulfill our role as an ally. Thank you.
Bye.
Here.
Thank you.